Hello and welcome. I'm Jer Zhong, the editorial assistant at Zócalo Public Square. At Zócalo, our mission is to connect people to ideas and to one another. Everything we do is free and everyone is welcome. We publish original writing and present conversations like this one. Find us at zocalopublicsquare.org and all the main podcast platforms. And if you enjoyed this conversation, please like it, follow us, or subscribe. We're about to hear from Kartikeya Singh, a senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He joins us today to discuss his article titled Bureaucracies for the Better, where he details how government institutions could be redesigned to mitigate climate change. And I'm thrilled to introduce Lisa Margonelli, who will interview Kartikeya today. She is the editor-in-chief at Issues in Science and Technology, and also the author of Oil on the Brain, Petroleum's Long Strange Trip to Your Tank. Over to you, Lisa.
I'm Lisa Margonelli, and I'm the editor-in-chief of Issues in Science and Technology. We're a quarterly journal published by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, and by Arizona State University. And you can find us at issues.org. We are delighted to partner with Zócalo to present today's conversation, asking, can bureaucracy start a climate revolution? Joining me is Kartikeya Singh. Kartikeya is the director of programs at the SED Fund and was previously a senior fellow and deputy director at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, where he led the Engaging Indian States Initiative. Kartikeya, thank you very much for speaking with me today. To start off, I'd like to ask you about this weird question that we're going to start on is, can bureaucracies start a climate revolution? I mean, we tend to think about climate revolutions coming through technology, entrepreneurs, money, big policy changes, and you've come up with this answer of bureaucracy.
Yes, and I think based on my experience and observation and engagement with bureaucracy in a couple of different countries, but one in particular, place that I was born, India, I would like to believe, seeing the arc of progress that has been made in terms of the revolution in the power sector in particular, that the bureaucracy can really be behind a climate revolution.
So let me dive a little bit into that, because we're talking about India, which is a huge country, and we're also sort of talking about how climate policy is not one size fits all. There are certain opportunities and certain possibilities in different places. And what you've seen and what you suggest is that there is a sort of particular way of approaching the issues in India. And that grows out of your experience, because you've been going there as an academic and as a policy person and as a thinker for at least 15 years as an adult. And tell me what you've seen. Tell me about this revolution that you've already seen in India.
Yeah, and it has. I think in the last 15 years, the country, from a climate and energy standpoint, has been transformed. So when I first sort of went as part of a fellowship to Delhi to very naively think I was going to solve India's climate and energy problems and write the policies, I was very quickly told.
2006?
2006. I was very quickly, told that in India I needed to sort of focus on the question of energy poverty and the fact that how could a country like India address climate change when 500 million people at that time didn't have access to electricity. And rightly so, India in the international climate negotiations that we hear about, on an annual basis that have been going on for decades, India was advocating for the right to emit more carbon to provide more cheap electricity powered by firing coal to this unelectrified population. And I think at that time when I went and did surveys in villages and started to really ask about, okay, what are the alternatives to providing access to electricity, if not through a grid, which was much smaller then at that time in its reach, what could be some of the solutions? And so I really started to focus on kind of the decentralized renewable energy solutions that had been being tested out for many years prior. I would say probably about 10 years prior, there had been many experiments and deployment efforts. And by these kinds of technologies, I mean solar home lighting systems, a panel, a couple light bulbs in a house to provide basic lighting. Other solutions like taking a small stream and attaching sort of a generating unit to it and generating electricity from a small hydro unit, or taking biogas that people could generate at their house if they had cows, allow the cow manure to ferment and feed it water and stuff. So figuring out how people were interacting with this. And
so if I can summarize that, what you're talking right now about the before times. You're talking about like 2006. The thinking then was like solar lanterns, moving from kerosene lanterns to solar lanterns. It was moving from maybe animal-powered processes to something that had a small hydropower process, something like that, a local biogas. Where are we now? I want to give people the sense of this revolution that happened. So where are we now? What happened to the 500 million people with no grid?
Yeah, so a lot happened to the 500 million people with no grid. So in that backdrop of trying to deploy smaller systems, the government kind of amped up its efforts and its grants and programs to extend the grid aggressively out to literally every home. So around 2016, I would say, or 2018 is when the government managed to get wires and poles out to every home to basically electrify every single household. And what I was trying to say before is that even the small home lighting systems that had barely thought about integrating LED bulbs, so India was not really a place where LED bulbs existed, has today brought the cost of LED bulbs by over 80% have decreased in a country like India, and hundreds of millions of these bulbs are everywhere because of new institutions designed by the government to get this energy efficient lighting solution out everywhere. So that was, on the power sector side, the conversation changed dramatically. And then people wondered, do we even need these small solutions anymore? I think, of course, we can get to it, but the conversation's coming back full circle to the value of decentralized renewable energy. But that transformation has been one of the starkest, is getting electricity to nearly every household. The other thing that I witnessed, I was participant in a journey, 2,500 miles across the country in an electric vehicle that was manufactured by an electric vehicle manufacturer back in 2009. That manufacturer was since acquired by a larger conglomerate called Mahindra. And we were trying to demonstrate that this indigenously manufactured lithium-ion battery powered Indian vehicle could have a role to play in India's mobility solutions at a time where electricity was not available everywhere. And today, we're talking about government policies that are fully backing an electric vehicle revolution for the country. We're talking about banning the internal combustion engine and in the not too distant future, and all kinds of incentives for the deployment of electric vehicles, not just four-wheelers, but three-wheelers and two-wheelers. So I would say that the India of 15 years ago and the India of today has made tremendous progress in terms of the direction it's headed. And we haven't even touched on the fact that on the renewables side, the equation has really been turned on its head in terms of which kind of energy will dominate India's power sector in the future.
So I want to get to that. So first, hooking 500 million people up to the grid and thinking about a future of electric vehicles is not trivial. I mean, it is changing the whole concept of energy poverty. It is making things available to people, other sorts of income streams. It's really, it's potentially transformative on many levels, from political to inside the home to the India's position in the world. But one of the other things that and that alone would be enough, but let's talk a little bit about this thing that happened in 2017 when renewables suddenly became cheaper than coal. So 70% of India's grid right now is coal, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and now the projection. So okay, in 2017, India was really hitting its stride in terms of designing auctions led by state government agencies for the bulk procurement of power from solar through long-term contracts. And one state in particular, the state of Madhya Pradesh, that's in the heart of India, really managed to crack this code and get all kinds of relevant financing institutions from international financial institutions, as well as structure the project in a way that would drive down the cost in the bidding that was done by the developers to an incredible low. And since then, India hasn't really looked back. And just, I think last year, the latest sort of auction for solar brought the cost of solar power down to another tremendous low. So we have reached a point in India where the cost of new renewable energy is certainly cheaper than the cost of new coal-fired power plants. And the projections are such that coupled with the declining costs of energy storage technologies and the combination of packaging these technologies together, renewable energy plus storage will be cheaper than existing coal-fired power plants. So we've come a long way, I think, in terms of which type of electron is going to really be the dominant force in the Electrify India future, if you will.
So there's a couple of interesting things here going on that you're talking about, and I kind of want to reflect them back. And one is, so India accomplished this incredible thing of getting the cost of renewable energy beneath that of coal-fired electricity. And that sort of set off a chain reaction, because if your power sector is all set up to use coal and they're all dependent upon coal, and someone can suddenly undercut them in cost, then what starts to happen?
Yeah, then if you are having too many institutions that are kind of locked into the coal value chain and they are being financed, by public financial institutions in many cases for more and more projects, then you're kind of end up left holding a bag of stranded assets, potentially really bad debt that you need to figure out what to do with. And there's a lot of people that are at work in trying to solve this problem. But one of the things is that the planning process, I think, maybe didn't envision the rate at which both business innovation and technological innovation pace would pick up to really allow renewables to start undercutting the price of coal, the cost of power generated by coal. And so now the challenge is really ensuring that this coal-centered economy can really start to pivot and be a part of the energy transition story and the green electrons that we really want to bring online. And I think that's critical for a place like India, where so much of the coal value chain is state-owned and not just privately owned, because they are responsible for the welfare of entire communities where they operate.
How many people are we talking about?
We're talking about somewhere between 20 to 30 million people, according to some estimates, that are dependent on the coal-based economy in India. And not just that. I mean, there's coal is really embedded as part of government revenues for the central government as well as certain states. And I think this is the case in other parts of the world as well, where part of your state budget comes from revenues from extraction of certain kind of extractive mineral wealth. That's a hole in their budget that they're going to have to try and find a way to fill. And then coal is transported by the Indian Railways, which is a national carrier, and it's a part of their business plan. It's something that's burned by the National Thermal Power Corporation. And it's certainly something that's controlled and mined by the largest state-owned coal mining agency, Coal India Limited. So but these institutions are really important to the economy. So I think their business plans will need to reorient to be a part of the growth story as the cleaner source of electricity really starts to dominate.
Okay, so you've got this, now we've got all the balls in the air here. We've got 500 million new people online on the grid. You've got that renewable energy is suddenly cheaper than coal. You've got 30 million people tied to the economy of coal, including all of these different structures. The railroads are also dependent upon coal. You've got all of these things moving. You've got India also moving to take a center role in dealing with climate change and reducing carbon emissions. And you also have India moving to take a central role in providing solar solutions to other parts of the country. So here are all the balls or the plates that are spinning in the air. And tell me how bureaucracy can help get this thing moving in the right direction.
Yeah, well, I think we need to understand a little bit about the bureaucratic structure of India. And there are far smarter people than I that have studied the Indian bureaucracy. I have had the privilege of engaging with a lot of bureaucrats in the Indian administrative system, which is one of the oldest bureaucracies in the world.
How far back does it go?
Definitely to the time of the British Empire. So it was definitely a part of the system that the British brought to help govern a pretty large area across South Asia, I would say. And
sort of.
Yeah. So a system that was meant from the district level to the capital to have people be able to track processes, to tax people, to deliver government services. And it's obviously evolved since that time period and since the partition of the subcontinent into several countries. But it is very much adept at trying to deliver those services. So the system is in place. And once given a mission, it can accomplish its tasks. So I think that we've come to a point where the system in itself can be given new mandates, a new guiding star to really help better leverage, the resources that the country is trying to deploy towards this new target, which, the Prime Minister of India, certainly this last winter, in December of last year, announced a net zero target for India. So what does this mean? This now means that the machinery is going to have to figure out a way to rethink its mandates to help meet that target. Now, the challenge is that the energy governing agencies in the country there are many, right? They are bifurcated focused on the power sector, which is controlled both by the central government as well as state governments. So state bureaucracies matter there. But when it comes to oil and gas, that's controlled by the central government. When it comes to nuclear energy, that's controlled by the central government. And by power, I also include renewables in that. So I think, and the drive to electrify everyone, there was a tremendous opportunity now to deploy electrons of any type to every corner of the country. But at the same time, there's a mandate to create a gas-based economy, to get gas to every home for cleaner cooking fuel. But I think that there is possibly a way to sort of combine these efforts now when the electron can do so much more, to really bring some of these agencies together and aligned towards a vision of a decarbonized energy service delivery agenda that's in line with what has been set.
When you talk about electrons, what you're saying is that an electron that comes from wind and solar is just as useful for making your morning tea as an electron that comes from oil or gas. The gas has to be imported from outside the country. So does the oil. The coal has to be mined within the country at a great cost. So all of these for the end user are completely exchangeable. Everything can be fed into this. And you could also use biogas, you could use hydrogen, you could start other sorts of value chains to sort of replace the coal one.
Yeah, so basically we're talking about changing the mindset, that is sort of fixated on the delivery of carbon to kind of the value chains that can be created to delivering, to storing, generating, and delivering electrons. And if we start to think about it that way, then the electric mobility revolution that India is currently trying to deploy across India can really find new life in rural areas. Because I think that there's tremendous potential for places that were previously unelectrified to now start using electric mobility as a solution. There has to be a way to stimulate demand for electrons once these lines have been laid out for these people. And one way is electric mobility, electric cooking, heating, cooling. And I think these are services that can be delivered by the existing system. It just sort of requires making sure that we're not just, there's not competing interests between the type of electron that we're focused on the electron, and the greenest and cheapest one is kind of on the horizon going to be winning, and as in many cases already is.
We have an interesting, the audience was asked, which kind of energy do you think will dominate India's power sector 15 years from now? And 71% voted for solar power over coal or wind, which is really interesting. I mean, you do have there is a lot of sun there. But it's also interesting that so many people see solar and wind as the future, because I don't know that that's within 15 years, that's significant. Do you think, so bureaucracies are known for being big and lumbering, and they have a not fully earned reputation in the United States for, being slow on the uptake. I wonder, how do you just aim, I mean, how do you get a bureaucracy to do this? Do you just aim a bureaucracy at a new target and tell them to go for it and they do it?
Yeah, I mean, listen, it's easier to birth new institutions, bureaucratic institutions, than it is to kill them or wind them down or completely overnight rewrite their mandate. So I think there has to be sort of a gliding path to sort of reorienting them. And I think this is not specific to India. I think this is around the world. This is in the intergovernmental processes. It's easier to birth new intergovernmental organizations too than to wind them down. So I think it requires some political will, of course, to sort of, you can go down that route to really mandate a pathway to transition. But I mean, where do we go? 50 years from now, will there be a need for a ministry of coal? Not just in India, but anywhere. What happens to that? Do we know what that looks like? Do we know how we sort of slowly meld that into something else? And I would say that you need to sort of examine the mandates and roles of the different departments in a ministry and think through how you can start to tweak them. The mining section of a ministry of coal kind of being reoriented towards critical minerals mining, which is so important to build it, to the building blocks of renewable energy, to a department that focuses on just transitions, which is really the topic that everybody is kind of starting to coalesce around.
Explain what that means, just transition.
So what that really means, and I think this is what I'm trying to say about even these energy institutions and bureaucracies, we're not talking about leaving, we're talking about changing mandates and technologies. And we're not talking about leaving behind the people, even of these ministries, right? They're part of a process. And so as the energy transition happens from fossil fuels to renewable sources, there will be new jobs created and people who will get them. There will inevitably be people who will be left behind, who may not, if we don't plan for it, really be in dire straits, and the entire communities that depend on them. And we see this in the West all the time. I think the classic examples is, West Virginia is one key geography. I'm here in Europe. They were talking about it in Germany and Poland and Bulgaria and places. So, India is at this place where publicly owned institutions, publicly run institutions that are responsible for the welfare of people that are wedded to the fossil fuel value chain have the time and space and the resources to begin funneling capital towards transitioning their own business models and the sort of whatever the communities might need to do next. And I think that's what a just transition is making sure that those people aren't left behind. And I do think it's a little bit easier to do with fossil fuel institutions that are state run, because it's not private sector. So it's not, the shareholder is the government, and it's taxpayers and the voting public. They can actually take care of pension plans in a way that I would argue, bankruptcy is not the same pathway for a state-owned enterprise as it is for a privately owned one. Because the private, the CEOs are not necessarily going to be responsible in a privately owned institution for what happens to the community after the company goes bankrupt. So
I would like to just, this is very good. I want to jump ahead a little bit and talk about taking very creative mandates so that the coal company, for example, is no longer earning their keep by finding coal and digging it up, but perhaps by cleaning up previous industrial accidents or areas that have been heavily mined. Or how do you start to redirect this all in a much more sort of a futuristic direction? And I think you've done a lot of kind of creative thinking about these mandates, how you can change, how they can affect roads, how they can be very cross-cutting, affect poverty, affect industrialization, affect pollution. Let's talk a little bit about that creative mandate.
Yeah, well, let's take the example, of an environmental sort of pollution watchdog, right? Going around to make sure that industries are compliant in whatever they're releasing, be it effluent, is it clean and up to standards, is it emissions into the air? One typically thinks of a bureaucratic system that's in the environmental pollution monitoring space is going around to check, to offer citations, to force implementation or closure. Instead, imagine an institution that is able to bulk procure pollution control technologies. And when they're going to a firm that is, making whatever it is making and seeing whether or not they are emitting, pollutants, rather than a citation, making sure that everybody has the pollution control technology to at least mitigate for that particular externality, so that we're not actually generating economic activity at the expense of the environment. Another way that I explored to look at this is—
Can I just interject a little bit? Lay that out a little bit more. So the inspector goes to the ice cream factory, and right now the inspector is likely to say, hey, you're shut down, you are dumping something into the water. So then the ice cream factory shuts down, people lose their jobs, who knows what happens? I mean, provided everything works. But then in your scenario, you're saying the ice cream inspector goes, he looks at the factory, he says, look, we have a contract to get scrubbers for your water, and we will get those ice cream particles or whatever's in there out before they go back in the water. Plus, we're also supporting this industry of scrubbers, which also employs other people. So what you're saying is that sort of this virtuous circle of environmental protection and
creating more jobs, right?
Industry jobs, yeah.
Yeah, imagine then you are potentially creating an ecosystem where you have new firms setting up to not only manufacture, but also innovate upon that incredible amounts of new kinds of pollutant control technologies. So I think, in coming with solutions rather than citations, that whole conversation is changed. And similarly, if a mandate is to get, fossil gas into every household for cooking, and by the way, you have to import large amounts of that because you don't have it for any particular country. Why not make it that you are basically ensuring that you can provide cooking energy solutions and at the same time make the country more energy secure by reducing imports? What does that do to the mandate? And in what ways could a bureaucracy start to rethink its own mandate and within those confines, rather than we will just dig it up, lay pipelines, and find more ways to pump those molecules through the pipelines to every home, which will vary, the price fluctuations on that fossil gas will continue to be a political headache time and again, and subsidies will have to be found from some part of the budget to make sure people are kept happy so that they can cook their food.
Mm-hmm. And so this is sort of moving to electric food cooking.
Yes.
That runs on that uses this grid and uses all these different sources. So one of the things that I think a word I've heard you use is intrapreneurs, and that is bureaucrats as as creative as an entrepreneur. Tell me about your experiences with this. Tell me why you believe in an entrepreneur and why you see this.
I think when you are, and I have had a short stint as in a bureaucratic structure myself, and I know what it's like to sort of be a part of a process, work things up a chain, make sure that bilateral or multilateral, policies are in line with what we want domestically. And I think that you get used to a process, but I think there are windows where you can then think about ways to improve the process. And particularly depending on at what level of governance and the chain of bureaucracy you're in, my experience has been in conversation that particularly in federal systems where states have quite a bit of power, there is ample space for innovative new things to be tested and for those ideas to sort of end up becoming national policy. And we've seen this in the US, we've seen it in India, other parts of the world where such structures exist. And so, I think as we're at the cusp of more clean energy, more disruptive technology being deployed, it's at the subnational level where where the money is being deployed, where the technologies are being deployed, that there is scope for the bureaucratic, if given the space, to individuals who are, willing to put their ideas out there to be able to test these waters and to innovate new types of policy design for sure, and that happens, but even think through how the institutions at the state level can be recast.
It's interesting because the story that you're telling about bureaucracies, we tend to think it's top down, but you're also saying it's bottom up, and that the experiences from the states or the towns or counties can kind of percolate up, while also directives can come down and support can come down. And you can end up with this meshing of the different levels that you don't necessarily get with sort of higher level climate policy. And that in fact, part of what you're talking about is getting the whole bureaucracy engaged in this process.
Yeah, and I think the ways that I have seen it play out, and I think I'll use a very specific example if there's time. I've traveled to an Indian state of Assam. It's in India's northeast, and it was. I've been there a couple of times. There's the state-based arm of India's Ministry of New and Renewable Energy called the Assam Energy Development Agency. I'd gone there to have a meeting. Outside the agency were the sort of relics of the agency's past, right? From an era when the states and the central government was really trying to socialize the importance of renewable energy and educate the masses about what it was. And the real government push behind it, right? So there's a huge demo vehicle with a solar hot water heater, a solar panel, a wind turbine that not at scale, and solar and solar lights and things like that. It is in this moment in time when I visited, I think it was in 2014. Tires were deflated. It was rusted and dusty. Outside the agency was also a model sort of solar government-run solar shop. Again, meant to help people buy subsidized solar products, cobwebbed, dust covered. Went inside, and the flurry of activity in this place was unbelievable. I mean, a passionate group of committed staff talking about photovoltaics, which is basically how to leverage ponds and water bodies as a means to deploy solar panels on top of them to generate electricity in places where you don't have much land, but maybe you're living in a water world kind of situation, which is Assam. And calling up a local entrepreneur who is busy setting up an electric vehicle charging business for a booming three-wheeler automotive market that three-wheelers are used to basically transport goods and people and are cheap, and anybody can get in the business of maybe putting together a vehicle or buying a vehicle and recuperating their costs to transport goods and people. And so it was a completely different thing happening on the inside than the shell, which was the outside. So the technologies had changed, the times have changed, the business models had changed, the people were still the same, and they were one step ahead, if not several, in trying to make sure that they were mastering the changing energy transition around them. And I think that's what we're talking about here.
That's such an interesting thing of really, really figuring out how to deploy the people who understand how all the little parts fit together. And for photovoltaics, you really need to understand your local farmers and your local ponds and and solar. And you can't fly in and come up with a wacky idea like photovoltaics and expect it to work. I want to go to a few audience questions, and then I'm going to ask you sort of a big question at the end. So we have one question. Can you say a little bit about what kind of retraining would be necessary for the bureaucrats? What sorts of funding process changes would be necessary?
What sort of funding process changes would be necessary? Is that what the question was?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, listen, I think that I'd be curious to know if such models have been tried by different governments. You know, one way that I have seen it play out in India more recently is giving a certain level of autonomy to bureaucrats to approve projects above, you know, raising the threshold of budget line item that a bureaucrat might be able to approve a project for or have use discretionary funds for. I think that would be a really interesting way to sort of allow bureaucracy or those in leadership positions in bureaucracy to be able to experiment with new ideas. I think exchanges with other, with sort of innovative institutions or think tanks or, you know, labs as it may be within the country or outside the country to get exposure is a way to kind of get one out of a system they're so entrenched in. And, you know, where resources are not there, I mean, I think that's where funding could be made that is more nimble to allow that flexibility for creating kind of flexible ministries, like transition ministries even. Like, can we pilot this out, this new initiative, park a team somewhere together whose time will be covered if we're afraid to use taxpayer dollars to do it. And I think those are solutions that are worth trying where governments are open to it, of course, because we don't know what kinds of solutions might emerge from such a process. So those are some of the ways that I think could be tried and maybe are already being tried by certain governments somewhere.
Yeah, I love the whole entrepreneurial aspect of this unleashing the creativity of people who've really given their lives to thinking about how to keep daily life running for the rest of us. We have another question. India was a relatively early adopter of nuclear power. What has prevented India from using nuclear to bolster its power generation? And how has the bureaucracy reacted to nuclear?
Yeah, well, this is a loaded question. And it's hard to not, I don't want to get too lost in the geopolitics of this question. There's, you know, India had sanctions against it for testing nuclear weapons by the, you know, global community of actors that controls nuclear technology. So one thing that India did manage to do because of those sanctions is actually put a considerable amount of domestic R&D towards it. It's amazing what you can do when you have sanctions that don't allow you to have access to things like uranium. You sort of put your money behind thorium and fast breeder technologies, which allow you to leverage an element that you have in abundance to see if that can be used with small batches of uranium, of course, to really allow your nuclear industry to flourish. Now, India has sort of come out of that shadow of those kinds of limitations, but unfortunately, the cost equation on nuclear for generation of power from nuclear in India just hasn't been, has not come or grown at the pace at other renewables. So at the end of the day, I think most people would say the cheapest electron should win. You know, it's debatable, you know, how green is nuclear energy. Some say that it's part of the solution, and some think that, you know, that it comes with its own baggage. Without going to that debate, I will just say that it's just not, it's not cost competitive. Now, that doesn't mean that it hasn't taken root in India, and I think that sanctions example of how it forces a country to react, and for the bureaucracy to then, you know, choose to invest and continue to do R&D in the space is quite telling that India was able to go down a completely different track. And who knows, maybe we might see a resurgence of nuclear, but right now it's really wind, solar, and energy storage, and hydrogen, actually, green hydrogen, that everybody is really banking on.
I think that the fact that they were innovating with thorium is really interesting, because that's it is a subject of a lot of discussion, I guess. It's the best way to put whatever's going on with thorium. So I wanted to ask you a little bit, we tend to frame climate as the policies as having winners and losers. And, I think another way of framing it is that everybody has to have, everyone has burdens to bear in the global climate regime. And one of the things I thought was very interesting about this thinking through the bureaucracy is that you start to see that there are opportunities to share. You start to see the problem in an entirely new way. So talk to me a little bit about that. How did this start to open up for you as you started thinking about it? And how can it be applied elsewhere?
Yeah, I think, listen, some of these ideas were sort of coming more fast-paced post-pandemic, of course, right? You hit a wall, you kind of shut the global economy down, and then you're emerging from that, and it's a struggle. And there's a lot of talk about building back better, right? In many parts of the world, and unleashing tremendous amounts of capital, the likes that we haven't seen even in the US for quite some time. I think that's, even the infrastructure bill is an incredible infusion of funds that we're still sort of figuring out how it's going to be used exactly. And so that all that money needs to be guided by a rethinking on the institutional side. And also every dollar spent now matters more than ever. And it should be going towards building a more climate resilient society, and one where we have less social unrest and jobs. Social unrest caused by economic insecurity is what I'm really getting at here, because there's no time to lose. I mean, I think the pandemic really showed that we need to build back better, and that one way. So the guiding paths really need to be making sure that we create jobs and that we're repairing ecosystems while we're doing it, because the pandemic is also, let's not forget, driven by a zoonotic disease that really came out of the problem that we have, the constant battle with the ecosystems that surround us. And I think to get at can this be done around the world and other parts of the world? Is that kind of what you were wanting to?
Yeah, I'm wondering, is this a sort of thinking that we should apply elsewhere? Should we stop looking? Should we? When you make carbon the center of the problem, you have winners and you have losers. And right. How do you figure out more winners?
Yeah,
and that's so, what the bureaucracy really is as a weapon.
Well, the bureaucracy and using the bureaucracy as a weapon. Carbon, we have made that the problem, right? And you see at the global stage, who's going to emit how much more carbon before we all kind of burn up, right? That's been part of the reason why the global debate and the negotiations on climate have been slow. And many would say that climate change is happening. It's going to happen. Now we need to survive what's coming, right. And build a more resilient society fast and find ways to remove carbon from the atmosphere. So, I mean, I think now we need to bring everybody along and not be sort of antagonistic entirely. I mean, it's true that many more ships need to be guided in the right direction and there needs to be more advocacy. But I would say that this is where the just transition piece really becomes, again, critical to making sure that the machinery in place that is sort of fossil fuel value chain driven, that is carbon driven, is made a part of the sort of electron delivery value chain and is part of the opportunity unleashed by the discussion of everything getting electrified. And I do think that the fact that we're headed in that direction of a electrify everything moment really presents that opportunity for so many more jobs to be created, for so much more ecosystem to be restored, and so much more better use of our financial resources.
I think it's a really interesting portrait too of how we could rethink industrialization away from the previous model, which involved, we call these things externalities, but you just emitted stuff and assumed that it fell on whoever was near the plant, and that was sort of their problem. And so it reinforced poverty, and it and how do you build a more how do you build a world where more people can live better lives rather than seeing climate policy as a way to stop development, which is sometimes the way that it has been framed, that we were going to preserve these forests and we want to preserve things here. But the way forward really is full transformation. We have another question about what are the chances of having sting operations at all levels of bureaucracy to enhance effectiveness of operations and very appropriate use of funds. I don't fully understand that. Do you know what a sting operation is in a bureaucracy?
It depends on where that question's coming from. A sting, I mean, like in my head, a sting operation is like, you know, maybe the boss coming down and not from within, I don't know, not maybe head of an agency, but maybe from like a much more senior portion of government sort of coming down to make sure. I mean, like this is, again, I'm trying to think through what this question could mean, but like making sure that, you know, files are moving, that funds are being dispersed and aren't being held up, or really asking people why they're being held up. I wonder if that's what a sting operation looks like, but I don't know who has the time, and do we need to fund an entire other machinery to just go in and do sting operations as opposed to sort of changing, you know, collectively a mandate of an entity and going through that exercise.
So someone else, thank you. Someone else wrote and said that they loved your video before the event where you bike to work. And you talked about some of these issues, and the person wonders if there are lessons or inspirations that you've taken from living there that you can imagine applying either in India, the United States, anywhere for your global citizenry.
Yeah, and without making it seem like it's an ad for the Netherlands, for those from the Netherlands who are listening, I mean, it is a really unique place to be. It's a country that has actually, you know, without 6 months of pumping water, 40% of the land would go under the ocean. They are masters of engineering water. So let's get that out of the way. And have sort of been able to modify their environment, really build this country out. But the infrastructure is just, I mean, it's next level. You get out of your house and you are in connected, protected bike lanes to any corner of the country. And I mean that in every way, right out to the rural countryside. And that allows a certain level of freedom and mobility that is unparalleled. And of course, pedestrians have the right of way for them as well. And you have a rail network, you know, that is renewable powered 100%. And the mobility options are plenty. So it's designed, and I think even communities are structured around rail stations. Everything you could need, you know, is planned in a way that makes sense, and, you know, so makes life on a day-to-day very easy. There's not this sort of struggle to get to the office in a sort of pre-pandemic world. There's not a struggle to get to a grocery store or get your kids to school and to work and back. And yeah, I mean, I think that it's really, I used to bike in college, and after that, you know, moving to the New England area, I wasn't really biking around. In DC, I didn't even dream of it. I think things have changed. And what I've noticed is, as roads shut down around the world, many cities, as they reemerged, were experimenting with just turning some of those lanes of roads into bike lanes. And that just makes so much more sense. I think if we reorient and reclaim our sort of living spaces for non-motorized traffic, the world would be a lot better.
We're going to have to close there. I think it's just it's a fabulous portrait. Also, what you're talking about really is bureaucrats figured out how to make the bike lanes end at the right place and connect to the train stations, and somebody's keeping all the pumps running. That whole sort of bureaucracy of engaged people who are working on this at the systems level and the very specific level just to keep daily life moving. And it's not a group that we talk about a lot as change makers, but this has been a fabulous conversation. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to speak with you, and to everyone in our audience, thank you for listening and asking good questions. You can visit Zócalo's website, zocalopublicsquare.org, for a summary of this talk, brief interviews with both of us, and many other great articles and events, including our future events in this series. And you can visit Issues in Science and Technology, where you can read Kartikeya's essay titled Bureaucracies for the Better. Thank you again, and I hope you have a wonderful evening.
Yes, have a good one, everyone.